Hello and welcome back to Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. The previous 5 episodes of this podcast have covered large political movements such as suffrage and larger religious movements like Christianity, but today we will shift to cover our first radical individual in the form of mass murderer Anders Breivik. We will dive into his early life and how that shaped his early beliefs, the formation of his ideology, and finally the horrific attacks on Norway in 2011 and the fallout after his surrender. This will give some interesting insight into what a seemingly normal ideology can transform into when taken to an extreme extent. So, with that background out of the way, let's dive into it. On July 22nd, 2011, 77 people were massacred in Norway at the hands of one Anders Breivik. This was the result of many variables, but radical nationalism and a contorted worldview were the primary culprits. Today, I want to take a look at our first individual radical of this podcast, and we'll examine his early life, parts of his 1,500-page manifesto, important influences, and finally the slaughter he carried out and the fallout afterwards. Born on February 13th, 1979, to Jen Breivik and Wens Bering, he experienced his first tragedy at only 1 year of age when his parents split. His mother moved away, taking him with her, and he would grow up under her oversight, occasionally visiting his father, whose work had led him to Paris, France. Anders had 2 half-brothers and 1 half-sister from his father, and another half-sister from his mother, but his relationship with them seems to be shaky prior to the attack. Specifically, it was recommended by a Center for Child and Youth Psychiatry that he be transferred to a foster home at the age of 4, but it was overruled in the courts. He and his father also had a falling out when Breivik was 15. However, some greater insight into his personal relationships can be gained from spending due time with the manifesto. Now we'll move to talk briefly on the development of his philosophy over the years. It would appear that the beginning of Breivik's nefarious activities would come at the age of 15 when he was arrested in relation to spray paint graffiti. This incident gains importance, however, because the group of graffiti artists he was with were a group of immigrants primarily of Muslim background, and he was never fully accepted by this group and was treated as a wannabe of sorts. This will become more important later in the story. He went on to drop out of his secondary education in 1997 at the age of 18, and soon after he joined the right-wing Populist Progress Party, or FRP, and its associated youth program. This party, though not inherently extremist, supports strong anti-immigration views and attracts many voters who consider immigration an important issue. Breivik's next illegal venture would come after a few unsuccessful legal attempts at a business, and it comes in the form of selling fake university diplomas, and he was actually pretty successful with this. He earned close to $700,000 between the ages of 2002 and 2006. And throughout all this, Breivik kept his eye on a political position within his party's ranks. Unfortunately for him, or maybe not so unfortunately, this would never come to pass, thus marking his break in both involvement and belief in organized politics. We're going to take a brief break to talk about the Populist Party and what it stands for. The Populists, or Progress Party in Norway, is of the stronger far-right-wing parties in Europe. They've been able to gain seats in parliament and have even stretched to being a governing party. They were established in early 1970, primarily on the grounds of being an anti-tax protest party, and this would quickly turn to anti-immigration and a break from the establishment within the decade. They would continue to grow until they were entered into government for the first time during the elections of 2013. A brief overview of populism, and I'm quoting the Sage journals here. Populism may be understood as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite. It therefore appeals to the working class individual with right-leaning tendencies. So, this party comes out seeming pretty in line with portions of the American GOP and isn't inherently dangerous. The only danger within its ideology comes when it's taken to the extreme. And this is all important as it gives insight into the actions of Anders Breivik. Now we're going to briefly speak of the manifesto and how it ties into the actual attacks. But before we get into the 1,500-page manifesto, it is important to note that Breivik is extremely wordy, often putting 10 words on paper when one would suffice, but I digress. Breivik begins his manifesto with a long-winded rant against cultural Marxism and political correctness. He quickly asserts his beliefs regarding the nuclear family and homosexuality, obviously distinctly negative for homosexuality and positive for the nuclear family. Here's a quote from him. "But what happens today to Europeans who suggest there are differences among ethnic groups, or that the traditional social roles of men and women reflect their different natures, or that homosexuality is morally wrong?" End quote. In my opinion, this quote perfectly embodies his feelings of victimhood regarding the asking of questions that seem harmless enough, but are really just masks for his true intentions. He goes on to explain that, quote, "As we all know, the root of Europe's problem is the lack of cultural confidence or nationalism," end quote. While immigration is certainly a hot topic in the United States, it's arguably an even bigger issue in Europe. Here we mainly worry about immigration from Mexico, and our politicians squabble over how to most effectively manage the constant flow of immigrants. But in Europe, there are many more countries for immigrants to come from, particularly in the war-torn Middle East. This has in turn riled up arguments from both sides of the political table regarding how to assist these struggling countries without disregarding the needs of citizens of countries without as many issues. Breivik is of the opinion that any amount of immigration serves only to mix races and fundamentally destroy the culture of a certain country, in his case Norway. His ideology comes to a point with this quote: "I don't hate Muslims at all. I acknowledge that there are magnificent Muslim individuals in Europe. In fact, I have had several Muslim friends over the years, some of which I still respect. This does not mean, however, that I will accept an Islamic presence in Europe. Muslim individuals who do not assimilate 100% within 2020 will be deported as soon as we manage to seize power." End quote. This quote uses many words to describe one specific train of thought. Those with different beliefs should be forced to agree or be deported. This belief, along with a hatred of anything that could bring changes to his white Christian Europe, is what led to the attacks of July 2011. I would love to continue to indulge in the manifesto and various nuances of Breivik's beliefs, but suffice it to say he is entirely an outcome of right-wing extremism. We'll now move on to talk about the attacks and the fallout after Breivik's arrest. At 3:26 p.m. on July 22, 2011, an explosion rocked downtown Oslo. The explosion came a short distance from the building complex housing numerous government offices, including that of the Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg. 8 people were killed and dozens injured. Stoltenberg was, however, unharmed. It should also be noted that the explosion took place earlier, or that had the explosion taken place earlier or later in the year, the death number would have been higher since most Norwegians take vacations at the end of July, and many of the offices in the area of effect were empty. It's unclear, however, whether this was an oversight on the part of Breivik or done on purpose. Officials determined that the explosion had been caused by a car bomb and drew parallels to the Oklahoma City bombings of 1995. Citizens of Oslo were advised to stay in their homes for fear of another bomb being detonated, and rescue and recovery efforts were put into full effect. Shortly after, police began receiving reports of gunshots on the resort island of Utoya, about 25 miles to the northeast. At 5 p.m., about 90 minutes after the bomb detonated in Oslo, an individual dressed as a police officer took a ferry from the mainland to the island of Utoya under the guise of a security check in connection with the bombing. At the time, the island was being used for a youth camp hosted by the Norwegian Labour Party, a left-wing, more socialist party, hence why it was chosen for the second stage of the attack. The security guard was Anders Breivik, and armed with an automatic rifle and pistol, he spent the next hour methodically targeting the roughly 600 young people at the camp, ranging from ages 10 to the later teens. He used his disguise to lure some of his victims closer with the promise of rescue, and due to the shortage of transport helicopters and the spread of law enforcement due to the bombings earlier, police response was delayed considerably. Help would not come to the island until 6:25 p.m. when 69 people had already been killed. Breivik was apprehended peacefully minutes later, and this would set in motion the final stage of Breivik's attack and attempted ideological upheaval, the trial and martyrdom. There is obviously no point in terrorism if you can never gain a stage from which to spout radical ideas. Thus, as with all other things, Breivik planned carefully in his manifesto for his trial after his arrest. Here's a quote from him. Your trial will offer you a stage to the world, end quote. Thus, the Norwegian government was faced with somewhat of a dilemma when handling the trial and prosecution of Breivik. And with attacks such as the New Zealand Christchurch shooter showing signs of influence from Breivik, was Norway responsible with its proceedings regarding the sentencing of Norway's deadliest mass murderer? Norway ended up choosing a sort of open book policy in regards to the prosecution, and all facts were available, as well as the manifesto made available, and everything was just sort of released for the public to view after this trial. On August 24th, 2012, a Norwegian court sentenced Breivik to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed in Norway, and it will most likely be extended every 21 years for the rest of his life. The Norwegian prison system works very differently than the system in the United States, and Norway takes prisoner abuse extremely seriously and consider measures such as solitary confinement to be torturous. The confinement of Breivik has shown their system to hold up its standards even when dealing with a monster of Breivik's caliber. He must be kept separate from other prisoners due to his danger in both spreading ideology and his propensity to violence, but solitary confinement violates the humane prison rules of Norway. Through several lawsuits brought by Breivik against the prison system, he has finally settled for sort of a 3-cell setup with a small gym, a library, and sleeping quarters. He even has a PlayStation to keep himself entertained. Now, you may find this information alarming, and frankly I did while researching, but if you take a deeper look at what Norway has done, it actually does measures to show just how deeply they believe in humane prisoner treatment and how they will not compromise those beliefs even when that is the intention of an individual like Breivik. They simply have not allowed Breivik to become a martyr for his beliefs. Where he may have expected poor treatment and borderline torturous conditions, they have given him the same as everyone else and repaid his complete hatred of their more socialist system with the most that they can give him. Now, whether you agree with this way of handling Breivik or not, and I would not blame you for feeling that he should burn at the stake for his actions, it does say something for Norway that they are willing to deal with Breivik in such a humane, uncompromising manner. Now we'll just kind of move into the final thoughts and what to make of all this. At the end of all this, what can we really take away from it? It's easy to say that Breivik was an isolated incident of extremism, and that we will always have to deal with mentally deranged individuals who would watch the world burn, and to an extent that's true. But incidents like this scar a country, as we have seen with 9/11 and the anti-Islamic sentiment that still resides within the United States, and the 20-year war that launched afterwards. Luckily, the reach of the July 22nd attacks doesn't seem to have been as broad, though as I previously mentioned, the Christchurch shooter in 2019 did draw some inspiration from Breivik. The larger problem comes with the popularization of nationalistic ideals. I certainly do not believe there is no place for some nationalism in society, so there has to be a balance of beliefs in order to maintain stability. But the allowance of extremism to foster and grow within larger communities under the guise of blanketing beliefs and ideas that people can easily grasp is a problem. We have seen it on both sides of the political aisle in the past year. When people get too deeply emotionally involved in an idea or problem, the divide between two sides only grows, and individuals on both sides become more extreme. This may sound like an oversimplification, but understanding the other arguments and feelings involved is the only way to resolve our larger problems. No one should ever be driven to kill 77 people in one day, and I doubt there was any saving Breivik once his ideology hit a certain tipping point, but maybe if someone had gotten to him at a younger age and had been able to talk through his feelings with some sense of neutrality, he may not have become so radicalized in later years. I am still parsing out many of my own feelings regarding dealing with an extreme political environment, but one thing I am sure of is, so long as we alienate others for their beliefs and are utterly unwilling to listen to their grievances, we will always drive some to an extreme they cannot back up from. The only message I'm spreading here is to love others and to not isolate individuals for their beliefs. It's better to listen to someone and try to find some common ground, then work forward from there, than it is to confirm someone else's beliefs by disregarding them entirely. But this has been the sad tale of Anders Breivik. It would be easy to go on for hours about nationalism, extreme right-wing beliefs, terrorism, and many other topics that we touched on today, but there just isn't enough time to do that all at once. Hopefully you can begin to see the importance of covering such incidences as these attacks and their political importance, as we got very little exposure to them in our traditional schooling. I have not yet decided on a topic for next week, but rest assured it will come. For now, this has been Radicals, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you all for listening, and I will talk to you all next time.